very warm welcome to our audience for yet another edition of our Leaders for Humanity series. And this morning, I'm extremely proud to have with us a very renowned, globally renowned economist who has been extensively publishing about some of the topics we're interested in, both in the English-speaking and the German-speaking world. A very warm welcome to Switzerland and Professor Bruno Frey. A good morning to you.
Thank you very much for your very kind words.
It's a true pleasure, and we were spending a few days together in a seminar last week. It was truly enlightening, so thank you again for that. And of course, a warm welcome to Antoinette as my co-host on this edition. We will be running a little bit fast through the introduction today, given some of the time constraints of Bruno's. So let me just briefly go to the agenda as always. We will quickly talk about our Good Organizations Inquiry. We will then properly introduce Bruno, and then we will go into the subject of today's discussion. And given Bruno's very renowned work on public choice and some of the challenges of modern institutions, we will focus on happiness and economics and the search for better institutions. And we will see what out of the work we can learn both in regards to good society and good organizations. So moving us on to the Good Organizations Inquiry, what is it all about? As we've said many times, it is really a search for how in today's fast-changing and complex world, organizations can become good actors in society. How can they step into the role of a good actor as a corporate citizen in regards to the ecology and ecosystem that they are a participant of? How can they become good enablers and containers for the communities that they host in regards to enabling them to flourish and to grow? And finally, how can they become breeding grounds for individuals to lead a good life and find, as we will talk about today, personal happiness and well-being? And with that, in a shorter version than usual, let me directly hand over to you, Antoinette, for a proper introduction of Professor Frey.
Well, I'm very glad that we have Bruno with us. Bruno has been a professor of economics, the director of research institutes, hold yourself since 1969. And that in itself is already just fabulous. He's one of the most cited economists who has turned over his lifetime to various areas of economics. For instance, he started with political economics, then went to psychological economics, economics of happiness. So you can see a whole array of different topics. He's a highly productive writer. So I was told he already writes in the wee hours of the morning for half an hour, almost an article or something like that. That, of course, is a little bit overdrawn. And he's a thought-provoking critic of his own profession, which I believe is quite important. He's holder of multiple honorary doctorates, of which I personally find the one from Aix-en-Provence the most enticing. And why is that the case? Because I heard that is also the town where most French people want to live. And I guess this is then a happiness maximizing place. Of his work, I think we find his research on crowding out, but also on happiness, probably the most influential one, particularly also outside economics, because Bruno, I have to tell you that almost in all interviews we've led so far, people knew one of your articles in these areas, which I believe is quite astonishing. And finally, I believe you are the reason why I studied economics and not only organization and management science, because with him, we always had to learn how to think critically, so really thinking, not only repeating stuff, and to address real life and big, hairy problems, which I believe is still very important, as we just heard in another seminar. So welcome, Bruno. And I think the first thing we want to give you is the opportunity to introduce yourself. So is there anything that beyond this very quick CV I was giving you would like to add for our viewers?
Yes, when I think what I have achieved so far, it is mostly having influenced other people and not my own production. And I'm very proud, I must say, that I have several of my assistants have become professors, and 5 of them even at the absolute top universities in the United States. And that's what makes me really proud.
That sounds wonderful. Otti.
Very interesting. And maybe another question, Bruno. I think in your research, you point out that there is a correlation between positive and meaningful activities and happiness. So what drives you these days after having explored much of the world of economics already?
To inquire new ideas. That is probably, no, that is a problem of mine. If I had started just doing one thing, for instance, I have a friend who did all his life the shadow economy. And now he's the Pope of the shadow economy, while I have tried to work in very many different areas, and that makes it difficult for people to remember what I did.
Wonderful. And I think we are very grateful to the fact that you've explored so many areas because we found so many interesting ideas. And let's then dive right into it. I will just bring up one slide, as always, briefly to frame our inquiry. So here it is. As always, what we will seek to do is to first investigate what is the good society and what is good. And here today, with Bruno being so outspoken in the world of happiness research, we will really focus on happiness in economics. We will then move on to not only good organizations, but actually good institutions, and learn a little bit from public choice theory, from what it means to build good institutions, and what potentially is transferable into the world of business. And finally, we will move to how can we individually and collectively become better and look at potential for societal transformation, but also transformation in academia. And again, I've read some outspoken articles of yours, Bruno, and we will be intrigued to hear a little bit what role universities and maybe executive education these days or leadership education can play. So this is the playground, staying in the metaphor, so to speak. I will stop sharing the slide. And I would suggest we go right into it with the first section, which is about good and especially happiness. So I think, Bruno, would you mind maybe framing this for our listeners first? You describe in your book on economics and happiness quite clearly and extensively how from a world of utility we have moved towards a world of happiness. What is the story? What was that change? And what does happiness, in your own word, mean for the comparison to utility, especially?
My story is that as an economist, I was educated that it is impossible to measure utility. And therefore, all the economic theory, microeconomics, has been developed without having to measure utility. And that was an achievement, but I always found it lacking. And so I looked around who could say something about measuring utility. Then I found out that some psychologists knew about how to measure utility and a little bit more broadly, happiness. And that was the way I came into the area. And the interesting thing is that at the beginning, my colleagues found it terrible. They said, you should read a textbook in microeconomics because there you find that it's impossible to measure. And if that had been, if they could have controlled me, they would have stopped everything about happiness. And this shows again, we should have an institution where researchers should have opportunities to go outside the received field. And that is difficult to do. And I think an institution we have in German speaking universities, namely the chair or Lehrstuhl, is one possibility because it gives you a little bit of independence. There are other institutions where you always have to go to a higher organization, for instance, the faculty, and then they discuss and decide whether they give you money to do research. And in my case, they would have said, no, happiness cannot be measured. That's ridiculous. That's bad psychology, etc. And
I think that is one remark, Antoinette, very interesting. It links to McIntyre's criticism of the institution vis-a-vis the innate goodness of the practice. And I think we will come to crowding out effects in a minute. But Bruno, I have one follow-up on the utility versus happiness, because I found your book very intriguing. Because the notion of utility, of course, goes back to the utilitarians and Bentham and Adam Smith. And you describe how at the beginning of the neoclassical economics, it is isolated of any measure because it becomes revealed preferences. It almost becomes a very clinical concept. And then your turn towards happiness and Easterlitz and others almost brings some real life pragmatism and some degree of mess back into that wonderful world of economics. And I wonder, is there a normative connotation, or would you say it's just an empirical change where people say, actually, it's not quite how the theory works?
That's a difficult answer. I think it's not very normative. It's just that we look at something different. And you mentioned the word real life, and that's something which I try to do. And unfortunately, in economics, as in many other disciplines, reality, the real life is not very important, but other theories and people and young scholars especially only deal with those theoretical conceptions. And perhaps one small thing, I started happiness research without knowing what happiness is. I didn't have a clear and a precise definition. And a lot of philosophers would say that's total nonsense. You must know exactly what you do research on. In economics, and I think that's a good thing about economics, we first start at looking at a phenomenon, and when we have studied it, especially empirically, we are able to define it. It's a totally different approach compared to what most philosophers suggest.
Well, that's wonderful, because that leads us automatically into the first big chunk of questions to this real life happiness. So first, I would like to know from you how you then make sense, how you measure happiness. And then I would like to know, what did you find were the main determinants for individual happiness? But to make that a little bit more exciting for you, what were the most surprising findings, at least from the perspective of economics?
The interesting thing is that we did not define happiness, but we started from the presumption that individuals know quite well whether they are happy or unhappy. And that now comes from psychology. We asked people the question, taken overall, how satisfied are you with the life you lead? And that means it's not a short run thing, because the weather is very nice, you are happier. No, it's the life you lead. But it's neither a very, very, very deep sense of happiness as some philosophers have inquired about. So it's something intermediate, but I think it's really what matters in life. And so we did research, we did surveys, asking people, taken overall, how satisfied are you with the life you lead? And we got very reasonable answers. Namely, most people in Switzerland, Germany, and in Western countries have a happiness level which is surprisingly high. It's something between 7 and 8 out of 10. And that shows that mankind, at least in our area, is quite happy. But I must immediately add, if one asks people in very poor countries, they are very unhappy. They are around 4 or 5 or even lower. And this is important because there are a lot of people running around in the world and say, oh, it's material welfare is totally important. It's all in your stomach. It's all in you. And you can be happy without any income. That's totally wrong. All the evidence we have says exactly the opposite, that higher income makes you happier. But of course, when you double your income, you are not twice as happy. That would be absolutely ridiculous. There is a decreasing return on happiness, on income for happiness, of course. You asked what I find the most important thing. There are two. One is, in addition to happiness, it's personal relationships. Knowing people, having friends, having a good family life, having a lot of acquaintances, that really is important for happiness. And in my own life, I changed it. Because before, I always thought, I don't have time to meet acquaintances and friends. Now I do it differently. I meet about 12 or 15 persons each, just in two, so that we are only 2 persons. And then we eat lunch or dinner and discuss for 2 hours. And then we meet again in 2 or 3 months. And that is very good for me because I meet very different people. I meet an ethnologist, I meet a chemist, I meet young people, I meet older people, etc. That is extremely interesting to me. The second very important determinant of happiness, in my view, is the political constitutions. When you look at why are some people why are some nations poor? I think we cannot say people are silly or less intelligent than the Swiss or less engaged or don't want to work. No, it's normally the bad political institution. Let me give you an example. If somebody starts something new in a very poor country, immediately all the relatives want to participate if you are successful and want to have part of the income. But even more importantly, when you are successful, politicians will note it and they start taking it away from you. So that being entrepreneurial in a poor society with a bad political institution, political institutions, makes it impossible for you. While in a country like Sweden or Denmark or Norway or Switzerland or Germany, you can start new ideas and become reasonably successful.
I would like to ask one follow-up question, Bruno, on the first part, the personal factors that correlate with happiness. And I recommend your work on happiness and economics to anyone interested in the research that is out there. And I think in your work on economics as a science of human behavior, I think you're pointing out the empirical nature of some of your work. I could not get a good feeling for the weight of some of the factors that play a role. And I think what you're pointing out in regards to money, you said, is mostly relevant for cross-country research, whilst inside a specific country, you can see some of the nuances of the decreasing return, so to speak, on income. But I only found one work that you cite, a German piece, where people have tried to understand the relevance of psychological personality factors vis-a-vis demographic and social factors. And I think the third bucket they call error, and it was roughly 30% in regards to determining happiness. What is your own perspective on how important is the personality of the individual and whether they're extrovert or introvert, etc.? How important is the socioeconomic contingency? And finally, the relevance of other factors, like you mentioned, institutions. Is there any weighting, or is it completely subjective?
I think the answer I have to give is I'm not a psychologist, therefore I don't know the first part of what you suggested, namely the really psychological, the importance of having relationships on a psychological level. I don't know anything about that. And I think the nice thing about happiness research is that economists and psychologists work together in a very interesting way. So I leave it to them. So I think the other aspects, namely material aspects and the constitutional aspects, are very, very important. And to say what constitutional is certainly how we are government, how much we can contribute, how much are we as individuals involved in decision making. And in many politicians elected, and afterwards they are a close group and are not interested whatsoever in what the population means. You can see that today in Germany, where they try to find a new government. They never speak about what people want, but rather what the other parties want. So it's a close group. And I think it's very important that there are institutions which enable people to directly participate. For me, democracy is coming from the bottom and not imposed from above. That is a fundamental difference also among political philosophers. And I'm one of those who think democracy means that normal people as you and me are able to participate. And the second aspect of this political influence on happiness is that it is important to be decentralized so that people are in an environment they know, and that things are not determined from above, as this is the case, for instance, in France. And I think Switzerland is quite good. You mentioned before that we met at a conference in a little, in the smallest canton of Switzerland, of 16,000 persons, which is very small, but that they know what is happening in their little canton and can make reasonable decisions.
Interesting that the little canton we went to was famous also because they wouldn't allow women to vote until 30 years ago. But I want to probably, Antoinette, make two more questions in this section and indeed then go on to the political institutions, which I think is absolutely fascinating, as you mentioned, Bruno. But I have one more question maybe on the nature of happiness and some of the problems with how people seek to maximize happiness. And I think what we've seen a lot in your work about some of the challenges in terms of biases and expectation theory in regards to how people fail to optimize happiness. I think that is worth digging in, maybe, Antoinette. And then I have one more question, taking it to a higher level in regards to justice. But
you mentioned now various times maximizing happiness and optimizing happiness. I don't think that this is the correct way to approach happiness. We live, and when we live well, as an outcome, you might say that is happiness. That is pursuing happiness in the best way. But nobody should get up in the morning and say, today I want to maximize my happiness. I think life is totally different. You live and do things and do other things. And you should, here you can of course influence happiness by doing important things. For instance, as I said, having more intensive contacts to other people, which many of our colleagues and people in business are so time constrained that they forget that family is important. And especially, I mean, today a lot of people speak about the family, but I think friends and acquaintances and an interchange without being stressed by time, I think that is very important and really leads you to be happier.
I think that is a very interesting point you're making, Bruno, and it has come across some of your writings. So not to maximize happiness. And I feel there's a little bit of a human sense in rather living your life in the moment in the most compelling fashion. I wanted to take this, again, a little bit this utilitarian versus normative versus, I think you could almost say, experiential, being in the middle of life, which I think is your approach. I wanted to take it to justice, because I think you mentioned Rawls and the veil of ignorance somewhere in regards to how people transactionally contract in their liberty to contract. So the concept of freedom being very prevalent in our today's society and in the notion of justice in the way that Rawls frames it. And I think I sensed a little bit that it is not entirely in line with your thinking. How would what you have seen in happiness research or wider economics relate to what is justice in society? Have you got a view on that?
I'm not very much engaged in this question whether something is just or not. I didn't do research on exactly that question. One issue which is very important to me is about this maximization of happiness, which is very often, governments are very often saying they are maximizing happiness, or people tell politicians that they should maximize the happiness in society. And I think that is a wrong approach, because nobody knows what the happiness of the of society overall is. I know how I feel, but not what all the others feel. And even more importantly, assume that a government says wants to states that it wants to pursue happiness. Not pursue, but even maximize happiness. The first thing they will do is they will manipulate the happiness figures, which is very easy to do. For instance, in some countries, including the United States, in some states of the United States, people who are in prison are not taken to be part of society. They are not allowed to vote, and therefore researchers don't ask them how happy they are. So if you include or exclude them, that makes a huge difference. And also with people that have psychic problems, should they be taken or not? So the government has a lot of opportunities to manipulate the overall happiness figure. Therefore, I think it's wrong to ask governments to maximize happiness, because we know that they will not really do it. They will rather change what happiness is measured and not how happy really people are. So I think it's sufficient to tell them, look, there are important things that happiness research tells you, and try to do it. To give you an example, unemployment meaning that you were employed and then you are kicked out because for some reason you lose the job. That makes you very, very unhappy, independent of the income. Even if you had the same income, you would be very unhappy because you don't have any contacts anymore. You are thrown out of society. So governments should learn from happiness research that unemployment is a very important thing. And I think Denmark does it very well. They allow that firms dismiss people, but they have a lot of institutions helping people to get a job very quickly again. And so the problem is approached in a very good way. While in other countries, for instance, in Italy, it's almost, or Austria, it's almost impossible to dismiss anybody. And then you are in the unfortunate situation that you stay in the firm, but in reality, you are no longer a useful member.
It reminds me, Antoinette, of Henry Mintzberg's point of care over cure. And I think Stefano Zamani was talking exactly about this. He said some of the challenges in well-being cannot be resolved by redistribution, because it doesn't address the notion of shame he mentions when people stand in the lines to get their benefits, so to speak, when they're without work. It requires a deeper understanding of the connotations. But I think, Antoinette, back to you and maybe into the next section.
Yeah, I think that goes very well with you finding overall that participation is extremely important. Is it participation in the work life or participation in democracy? So I would like to go back to one of your main findings, and one thing you have told us forever, that is about direct democracy and federalism. And here I'm, of course, taking up also the other side, the public choice side or the political economic side, and would like to know a little bit deeper from you. It seems to be good for happiness, but what about efficiency, and what about the conditions? So, I mean, you know, most people would say, well, Germany is too big, we can't do direct democracy, or others would say, the legacy of France is centralization, how could we do federalism? What is your answer to these typical comments?
Antoinette, thank you very much for this question, which is, of course, very important. I just want to repeat, the possibility to participate really raises happiness. We did research on that and could empirically, statistically show that this is indeed the case. But the efficiency question is very important. In most countries, I think, for instance, in France or in Germany, most people think you must leave the important question to the politicians who are specialists on these issues. My view is different. It's not that direct democracy in the sense of being able to say yes or no, which is the important thing. It is the discussion taking place before the vote. And we can observe that in Switzerland. In Switzerland, people speak about forthcoming referenda in the family, among friends, in the restaurant, and just, of course, in the newspapers, in the social media. And that is very important, that there is an exchange of views, of positive and negative views on a referendum. And I think that is what really democracy is. And it's even true that when an outcome is very close, let's say 50.5% are for something and 49.5% are against it. Afterwards, after the vote, there are adjustments. One takes into account that the minority is very large and the majority is small. So one sees there are two aspects which have been discussed before, and then one should consider it. Let me give you an example. There was a vote on whether people Swiss men should be constrained, forced to do military service? And the answer was yes. So one was forced to do military service, but immediately afterwards, immediately means half a year later or a year later, civil service was introduced, and it's now used by many people. I think that's a convenient way to consider the interests of normal people.
Can I ask a question on here? Because I found your early writings on public choice very interesting. And as I told you last week, it's an uncharted territory for myself, really. I wondered, so I came across, first and foremost, the vote maximizing models, where public actors seek to just do whatever's needed to get reelected. And there was a notion that potentially that helps them to support the preferences in the population. But then there was a whole theory about political business cycle theory, where potentially they might do things that exacerbate the situation, or even rent-seeking and special interest theory. So is there a situation where we have in modern states very often a non-optimization, so to speak, or not even a clear enough interest in supporting the population in becoming happy, so to speak? How do you see that territory?
Yes, I think politicians are indeed very, very interested in being re-elected, which could be termed vote maximization. They make a lot. I mean, politicians are people who are good in talking. And so they talk about what they presume doing for the society, while in reality they want and must be re-elected. So that is a very important aspect. But after the election, they forget all this and are a closed circle. And there are many deviations from the interests of the population. And one interesting aspect you just mentioned, Otti, political business cycles, which means that between elections, politicians and the government pursues a policy which is considerably away from the interests of the population as a whole, and towards when the election is coming again, they try to adjust a little bit to what people want. And that is interesting for economists, because Keynes said, when there is a depression, then you should spend money, while the political business cycle does exactly the opposite. It creates business cycles. And that's a new aspect which I found to be quite interesting, and which we found that it exists in several countries, in many countries like the United States, Germany, and others.
It's very interesting. And Antoinette, it resonates with, I think, Paul Adler's view that we will, I'm sure, hear more about, where he suggests that modern governments will not be able to create that institutional environment, Bruno, that you're talking about. Because on the one hand, I think what you're hinting at is that their own behaviors might not be conducive to creating the environment. And secondly, special interests have come to be very strong in pointing or in guiding the government towards kind of the well-being of few rather than many. And I think this is also, again, Henry Mintzberg said, in the United States, we have the best democracy money can buy, because so many people can influence the government with their money. So yes. What's your view? More direct democracy, is that in itself going to solve the situation?
And may I just very quickly chip in, because Vater just looked at direct democracy again in a review article, and he came out that the jury is still out whether direct democracy too is influenced too strongly by certain interest groups. So it's more for the few than for the many. We're really interested in your answer here.
Special interests are very important also in direct democracies. But I think the interesting thing is what interests are organized. Some are very strongly, and others that are equally important are not organized. For instance, today, environmental and climate interests are strongly organized. Others, for instance, regarding the distribution of income, are less organized. For instance, or one aspect of this is that in parliaments, people with lower education and lower level jobs are not represented in government. And that is so Parliament is not really representative in this sense. Therefore, Margit Oslo and I and Katja Ross are strongly engaged in suggesting that one takes a real random selection of people, of people in a nation, and forms a chamber of government, of parliament, based on this representative selection of people. One could still have the other types of parliament in Switzerland, for instance, the Nationalrat and the Ständerat, or in the European Union, there is a European Union Parliament, but we should have an additional one where really people are represented in a true way. And that would change the discussion very, very much. And there are very good examples in Ireland and in other countries where decisions have changed because those people who otherwise have no say in politics can at least can make themselves express themselves. And it should be really an important decision and not just some type of advice to the government what to do. It should be binding. Otherwise, politicians say, oh, yes, that was very nice to hear what the population wants, and now we go on.
So it's not only a council, but it would be a true decision body. And what I hear is, first, you told us again, please compare. It's not better in representative democracy than in direct ones. So that's the first thing you told us. In direct democracies, you still have some further checks and balances. And then even in direct democracies, it would be a good idea to have this random draw in the representation to make sure that we have some of these other interests not institutionalized, now institutionalized. But let me go a step further, because that all also, I believe, needs to be met by good citizenship. And I mean, that's of course another important area where you are doing research, particularly when you say we also have to think about citizenship in a more unconventional way. So you are a champion of what is called flexible citizenship for a global society. Maybe you can tell us a little bit what this is all about. And I think it has a new name, you told me, in Appenzell, but I didn't find the new name so quickly.
Yes, I have a proposal. Today, somebody is a citizen or is not a citizen. Let's take a concrete example. Very soon in Switzerland, we will have a referendum on whether young people aged 16 to 18, after 18 you have the normal voting right, but those between 16 and 18 years of age have no voting right today. And now there's the proposition that they should have a complete voting right. I have a different idea. I would like to have a vote on that question. And if 80% of the people say, yes, let's give a vote to those between 16 and 18, I think they should have a vote, but only with a weight of 80%. Let's assume another case that only 20% of the people think that the young ones should have a vote. Then they should have a vote, but only one with a weight of 20%. And this weight is very easy to introduce in a modern society, in a digital society. That's absolutely no problem. So the young people would slowly get more and more vote, and at age 18, they would have a vote of 100%. And the same procedure I suggest for foreigners. Let's assume that a manager comes into Switzerland for a year or so. He or she has no interest in Switzerland because he or she knows that she will go away in 1 year, and they have no relationship to Swiss people, etc. So they have very little knowledge about Switzerland. Therefore, I think it's ridiculous to give them full voting rights, though they are foreigners. So again, I would think we should have a vote on that. And for instance, suggesting that when somebody has been in Switzerland 5 years, or no, let's say 4 years, let's have a vote on that, whether they should have a voting right. And again, if 80% think, yes, after 8 years, they should have full voting rights, yes, then give it to them, but with a weight smaller than 100%. And after, when they have got the citizenship, then of course they have full voting rights.
I think, what a wonderful idea, Bruno. Thank you. So fractional votes. What came up whilst you were talking for me, though, was Bill Torbert's discussion of Rousseau. And Rousseau famously striking that difference between general will in regards to the common good and almost like the aggregation of individual wills in kind of methodological individualism. And I have the feeling, is there not a difference between 20% of people, and maybe even the elder ones in the lead, thinking that younger people should vote, and some general principle whereby it might be much better if the young people got 100% of the vote because it's their future, so to speak. So are we not having a challenge if the individuals in society are not fundamentally interested in the common good? And that reminds me of Canero's impossibility theorem, where I think he's arguing that you almost need a benign dictatorship to overcome social choice problems, because in a society where negative individual freedom is the main arbiter of social choice, you're getting always into a position of impasse. So don't we have a problem with preconditions for your system to work in the interest of all?
Yes, I see the issue, but I think that our society should be built on individual values, and they must be aggregated put together in a reasonable way. That this is the important issue: how to do that. And my idea is not only through elections, but by direct participating in various forms. And I think this contrarian view that there is something like a social whole which exists somewhere, but is not empirically really, cannot be identified empirically. That is not my way of looking at politics.
So I think one question is there a common good? How would we define it and measure it? And as you said, it's not about maximizing and optimizing a general happiness curve. I wonder kind of how we would get around that. But I think another point is, and Antoinette pointed to that in the pre-discussion, if we take Brexit as an example, where people arguably voted, and the vote was very slim, of course, right? I think we had a number of factors that are interesting. We had politicians that couldn't be held accountable for what they suggested. We had a misinformation campaign, arguably, where people were portraying the benefits of Brexit very badly. And we had self-interested politicians. So do we need to solve some of these challenges before direct democracy would lead to better choices?
I must say Brexit is an unfortunate example of a direct vote, because there was no serious discussion before. As I emphasized before, the important thing before a referendum is the discussion. We must know the pros and cons. And that was not done in the United Kingdom, and that's very unfortunate. Coming back to what you said about the common good, I think we should stop thinking about the common good. There is no such thing as a common good. And you rightly referred to Arrow, who said it's not possible to say what the common good is. I think the right thing is that we have the right processes to discuss the pros and cons of every aspect which has to be politically decided. And then the common good will be a result, but it will not be directly imposed by politicians or by somebody else.
Yeah, so I mean, if I paraphrase, and hopefully it's correct, in the end, it's all about deliberation, about learning how to come into dialogue, which we, I think, can say have much more often happening here because we're used to initiatives and referenda, which probably is the difference to other countries, which just throw in one and then think everything happens. But I would like to still go back to the citizenship, because that also means that people are willing to engage in a dialogue and behave and step into the citizenship role. And here as well, you were saying, well, maybe we do have to reform the citizenship role, not only with the voting rights, but also with other aspects, so that we can choose, for instance, several organizations we want to be citizens of. Mm-hmm. And I just, because I find this a really original concept, I would like you to tell us a little bit about it, and also maybe about the possible problems which could arise and how to solve them.
Thank you. I think that is indeed a valuable idea, that the national states that we have today are historically given. I can see no reason whatsoever why Constance is part of Germany, why Schaffhausen, which is on the right side of the Rhine, is Swiss. And that is just historically given and has no further content. I think we should totally renew federalism in the sense that we should look, where are the problems? What problems do we have? And what is the region or the extension where they are? Take the Bodensee, the Lake of Constance. There are 3 nations involved, 2 Deutsche Bundesländer, Austria, and about 3 or 4 even Swiss cantons. They should form a unit of their own and have the possibility to raise taxes and determine expenditures for this one thing, namely to arrange the Bodensee as, let's say, as a tourist region or as a water provider or whatever. A totally different issue would, for instance, be how to cross the Alps. Why should Portugal have any interest in that? You know, in the EU, Portugal would have as much interest as Germany and Italy and other countries So let's have a new area which deals exactly with the problem of crossing the Alps, but only with those that are involved. And then they should be able to raise taxes and do the expenditures as they see fit. And then we would have a better arrangement of decentralization. And people would, over time, get used to these things. So they get involved because they can decide. I think these units should not be technical or technocratic units. They should depend on referenda and on elections.
Very interesting, Bruno. And you've given us lots to thought about. I think, personally, I'm not entirely convinced yet that the common good doesn't exist. And I think the fact that we had some referenda in Switzerland, even where, to your point on the the ecological problems of today, people were voting in disfavor of increasing environmental regulation and so on. I guess I'm still troubled with whether the individuals will always be in a position to remediate some of the societal issues that influence everybody. But I think your point on they need to have information, Antoinette's point on they need to be interested in being good citizens, so to speak, in the process sense of it, I think those are certainly very, very valid preconditions. And I wonder if we now can go to the organization.
May I make one point to that?
Please do, Bruno, please do.
When you look at Switzerland, do you really see any big absence of social common goods? Let's say infrastructure. The infrastructure in Switzerland is reasonably good. Not perfect, certainly not perfect, but reasonably good when you look at how bridges are, how roads are, how the public transport works. When you look at the environmental conditions, they are, again, not perfect in Switzerland, but reasonably good compared to many other countries. So,
what about gender equality, for example?
Gender equality is reasonably good in Switzerland. I want to come back to what you said about Appenzell. They introduced women voting 30 years ago only. But why did it take so long time? Because men had something to lose. I mean, that's a very economic explanation. They had very much to lose. Therefore, they didn't want to share that. While in a country like France or Germany, where voters, male voters, have little say anyway, they can well give it to the women also.
I will bring that comment back to my friends in Germany, Bruno. Thank you for that. Yes. I want to move us, given time, to the organizational section. And of course, for Antoinette and I, the good organization is really at the heart of our inquiry. And my first question is very generic, Bruno. From what you've seen in the political economy domain, what are the transferable key lessons for organizations as institutions?
Oh, that is a deep question. If I was able to give a good answer, Antoinette would have she would lose her professorship. No,
I have to give a short answer, Bruno, to make sure.
I think organizations must be, participation is important, but not the only thing, that's clear. The participation should decide what decisions have to be taken quickly by some institution or other, for instance, or what decisions can be taken after extensive deliberation. And may I come back to Switzerland, where to some extent, we have this system. We have 7 people who have equal power in government. And I think that has a lot of advantages because a lot of different views come in automatically. Compared that to the American president, he has to go out and seek what other interests are. While in Switzerland, with the 7 people from 3 or 4 parties, this is always really present. And then one of my research areas of interest is terrorism. And I think the Swiss way of organization has a huge advantage. Compare that, what is the advantage of Switzerland? If one of the 7 is killed by a terrorist, nothing happens because there are still 6 others and they know exactly what to do. Compare that to the American president. When he goes to a different country outside the United States, 400 civil secret service persons accompany him. That's ridiculous. And therefore, I think the Swiss system with 7 equal persons is superior also in this respect.
I would even say it also helps against overconfidence, another thing you're looking at. So that's very nice. If you're one of the 7, you cannot make out that you're the biggest hero. And of course, there were other things, and I think people can read it. That's why I just kind of drop it. You were, of course, saying very early managers should be paid like bureaucrats. So that's another thing to be learned from public governance. And then, of course, here we could also have a look at your random sortition again, another important aspect, how to reform. But I have to say, I mean, I could defend management science now. We also looked at some areas and we stole not only from your area, but also, for instance, from religious institutions. So there is something called sociocracy, which is coming from the Quakers. And here you also did some research. So I would like to have a look at the cloisters, because I find indeed sometimes I would love UBS to be a little bit more like a Benedictine cloister than what they are at present. So can you tell us what was interesting for governance you learned with the cloisters, which could be interesting for all organizations?
With orders, the interesting thing, the Catholic Church has a lot of different orders. I suppose at least 100. And the interesting thing, each one of them has a special task or a special way of organizing in monasteries. So the Benedictines are rather broad, while, for instance, the Cistercienser in German, Cistercians, are almost the whole time in the monastery, don't talk to each other. Another such a very strict order is the Carthusians. They only talk, I think, half an hour per week with each other and live well. And the interesting thing is they have existed over many centuries. Compare that to firms. A firm that is 30 years old is considered to be old and well established. In the Catholic orders, there are many that are 1,000 or 800 or 600 years old. And therefore, it's interesting to look at how they are organized. And all of them have an active participation role of the members, the monks and the women monks. What is the word?
Nuns.
The nuns, yes, the nuns. They meet regularly, I think, in most orders every week and talk to each other. And the abbot or the abbotess has to listen. But then can take a decision, but they are dependent on the views of of their members, and that makes it very interesting. Another interesting thing is, where does the abbot come from inside or from outside? And it seems that it is better from inside than from outside. They are more effective because they already know the problems. And a third thing is that the monasteries survey each other. So the abbot of a monastery goes to another monastery and checks whether they really attach to the goals of the order. And he has an interest in that because his own prestige depends on that. May I introduce another thing which is not only connected to orders, but to the Catholic Church. That is, I think, in every group that discusses, like shareholder meetings shareholder meetings and things like that, there should be an advocatus diaboli, a person that has the task to talk against what is, for instance, suggested by the CEO. And he should be taken seriously. And that means that he must have a career potential to go on in a higher level group, etc. Today, what happens in shareholder meetings, it's the CEO says something, and then the members nod, and that's it. And that had very bad consequences, especially for Swiss banks, because nobody said something. An example again, the Raiffeisen Bank, which is the third or fourth largest bank in Switzerland, had a CEO who did whatever he wanted, and nobody objected. But if we have had an advocatus or advocata diaboli, they should have asked, is it correct to invite persons working with the bank in very expensive hotels, for extensive meals, and even for sex? They of course, that would have changed things.
I find it very interesting, Bruno, because if I understand your reasoning, it is really focused more on the process of getting to good outcomes. And I think, as Antoinette already mentioned, in an article you write on what we can learn from public governance and organization, you cite fixed compensation, as Antoinette mentioned, bureaucrats' pay, division of power, rules of succession and rotation, restricted terms and re-elections, and then institutionalized competition. So all process interventions, I think by the same token, the role of the internal devil's advocate is to a degree a process intervention. But I wonder, and I know you're critical of ethical capitalism, so to speak, but is there not a normative question still? Because the devil's advocate would need to intervene on the basis of some understanding of what good is, to say, you are maximizing profit in the interest of your shareholders, which maybe is exactly what you should be doing. But there's a wider challenge, which is actually this is not leading, let's say, to the ecologically valid answer. Is there not still, are you not avoiding the ethical problem?
To avoid it, we could have more than one advocatus diaboli representing the main, what we consider to be the main interests. I would like to come to again emphasize the process is the really important thing, but the process must be guided by a constitution or by an institution, because otherwise the process is just talk and then people go home and nothing happens. I think the important thing is always to talk, to have a serious deliberation, to have all the cons and pros and cons on the table, but then take a decision and put it into reality. Otherwise, it's just talk. And that
which reminds me of the discussion, Antoinette, we had about Habermasian dialogic ethics and some of the work with Andreas last week. One final quick question from me, and then back to Antoinette. Co-determination. I think you mentioned it to a degree. I think the studies on the German model of co-determination is sometimes are not entirely clear. Do you have an opinion on whether that is a good model or whether there are some challenges with the German way of co-determination?
The German co-determination worked reasonably well. We can see that the economy developed quite nicely, and the differences between income are not as large as in other countries, though they are still large, and we should do something about it, but they are not excessive. It's not true that in Germany there are people who are very, very poor and hungry, while there are very, very rich people around. That's just not true. So I think this deliberation aspect is very important, but again, we must have a constitution or an institution which really supports the various views, that they are taken into account.
And I think here we are almost at our own institutions, because I would like to have a look at transformation. And I think once again, you were very outspoken that we need to change the way we do research, the way we organize universities. So I would really like to give you the floor to tell us a little bit about your criticism and how we should change things. That I think is most important.
Thank you, Antoinette. I'm very skeptical, I must say. I have become more and more skeptical about universities. I mean, I spent my life at 4 or 5 universities, so I know a little bit how it works in various countries. I was in Germany, I was in Switzerland, I was in the United States, etc. I think what has gone totally wrong is the Bologna system, how we applied it. In principle, the Bologna system had nice goals, namely shorten university education and intensify people going to other countries. I fully support that. But what happened is exactly the opposite. The way of study has deeply changed. Today's students essentially have to collect points. They run around the university and look where do they get most points with least work. And that has, of course, advertised on blogs by other students. So that has become the established way of doing research. And we professors know that when you start a lecture and want to explain what is the subject, what is important, etc. Students listen, and at the end, they always ask, what do we have to know in order to get the points? And so it's no longer the interest in the subject, but it's the interest in gaining points. And I want to emphasize that's not the problem of the students. It's we who introduced the Bologna system in this way. And internationally, before the Bologna system was introduced, a lot of students went outside to other countries. It's just not true that it's only now the case. And now it's, again, very limited because students have to gain points even when they are outside. And then points, let's say, from some Portuguese or Spanish universities are not accepted in our system, at our university, though they should be, but they are not.
When I went to study at Haas School of Business at Berkeley, even those points were not accepted back into the European system. But Bruno, and if you allow me one more question, because I know we're out of time, but it has been wonderful, and I love your passion and the way that you're bringing true real-life economics to the table, and I hope our listeners and viewers will enjoy it as well. But I have one more question, because the Bologna system I agree with, but that is letting you off the hook too easily because of two reasons. Because you have written, and I've got proof in front of me, one, publishing as prostitution, which I found very intriguing in regards to your very own educational system going towards, I think Margit worked on the new public management challenges. And secondly, what I found very refreshing, you had an article on Are Political Economists Selfish, in which you claim it's a selection problem rather than the nature of the economists. But I would still like to ask you, are there not some challenges that are also making the academia less impactful potentially, or less positive in regards to the education of the future leaders of big organizations?
Yes, I agree. There's a huge problem. The first is this publishing as prostitution means that academics are under heavy pressure to publish. They don't get a job at a university and as a professor if they have not published. One can talk a lot about how well they do research and how well they do teaching and how well they connect to the surrounding, how important they are to students. That's talk, and afterwards one only looks at what are the publications. That's very unfortunate. So I have a totally different idea, which I call the other university, in German, die andere Universität. And the idea would be a group of experts chooses people who are interesting, unorthodox, and engaged. And they don't have to have an Abitur or Maturität. They could have eine Lehre. And then one would discuss. And at the end of the discussion, there would be a switch to empirical research. So that this new academy, which I suggest, is not just talk, but then in the second stage, they would have to take the most modern techniques of empirical investigation, broadly conceived. And at the end, let's say after 3 or 4 years, there would not be a final exam, but solely has this person be active in this other university, which I propose? And there is yes or no. And I think within 1 or 2 years, the business people would see that these are the interesting people which they would require for their firm or other organizations, and even the public bureaucracy would consider these to be the interesting people, and the others who just want to or have to collect points are no longer relevant. So I don't want to kick away universities, but I think there should be something new and open, and it should not get any money from government, because as soon as government gives money, they impose all their restrictions and their view of how a university is. And of course, I know that this is somewhat idealistic, but I'm looking for a person who is who is able to put this through, to find money, and to push it through.
It's very interesting, and with the close of this, and Antoinette will lead us into the closure quiz in a second. But I think, Bruno, it's very interesting. I see some parallels. your closure in regards to academia, I think, Antoinette, resonates with Henry Mintzberg's closure, where he's saying managers are educated through real life, messy kind of understanding of how things work in practice. And that's what he's been trying to do at McGill University. But I also think Bill Torbert very clearly stresses the idea that phronesis, practical wisdom, what he calls action inquiry, is learned through that real life exchange. And maybe we go back to the old adage, Bruno, that non scholae sed vitae disciplimus, right? It is not only for life, it is in life, it is with life that we educate ourselves to become, let me close on this point, good corporate citizens and good citizens. And I guess there's something where indeed that formation process reminds me of what Simon Weston talks about in terms of monks. He said monks get educated in the community, and within 4 to 5 years, they find the priest within themselves. And I really love this discovery process, which I think is very different to what I used to do in selection processes in big companies. So again, Bruno, thank you so much for all these great ideas. Into the final quiz, which is a 1-minute round. So we will give you a few ideas and concepts and just invite you to briefly give whatever comes first to your mind within a minute to close us down. And Antoinette is going to lead us, and let's see what comes out of this closure.
Yeah, we do that in a second, but I just remember that our president is now trying to form a research institute in a more normal fashion. But wouldn't it be interesting to tell him your idea and he would come up with that type of academy? So you have to talk to our president at the University of St. Gallen and make sure that this is going to happen. Okay, but to close us down, as already suggested, I will now jump into the lightning quiz and give you just options and you can choose an option. So the first one is to learn more about the good life. What would you rather do? Regular dinners with fellow happiness economists, spend a year traveling, or spend a year with the Benedictines?
Traveling.
I kind of knew that.
But I had to think about it.
Yeah, okay. Good societies need benevolent dictators, less inequality, or better citizenship?
Better citizenship.
Okay. That was almost clear. Now, whom of that would you choose? Hayek, Friedman, or Sen?
Sen. He is broader and not as ideologically fixed. Yes.
Direct democracy or random choice?
Both. It's really both. With random, with aleatoric democracy cannot be everywhere. It must always be put into a frame.
Okay, then economics without psychology or psychology without economics?
Psychology without economics.
Wow, okay. Now that was a surprising one. Wonderful. So we have come to an end then, and Otti has a
question, Antoinette.
Yeah.
We cannot let Bruno as an empiricist get away without our final question, which was, if there was one thing you could change in the world to make it better, what would it be?
Oh, for heaven's sake. More co-determination.
More co-determination. And I love that the theme of social, relishing the relationships. I think that is something I would take away from this discussion. Again, I recall Henry Mintzberg saying there is no we in economics. It's an atomistic, individualist methodology, whereas I think you have again brought this notion of relations, relational goods, we, without necessarily the common good, but certainly in terms of the warmth and happiness that relations provide, back into this call. And I thank you for that, because that certainly is very close to our own thinking. And with that, Bruno, it has been marvelous to experience you last week in real life and today in virtual life. And I want to thank you wholeheartedly for having taken the time with us today and for your many, many insightful, inspirational, provocative, and sometimes radical ideas that you're bringing into the economic and political profession. And please keep on doing that, because I think we need it.
Otti, these are wonderful words of you, and I greatly thank you for all that, and also for to Antoinette for her very challenging questions. It's the first time that I do such an interview, but I can only congratulate you. It's really challenging to me and most interesting. Thank you very much.
Not that we realized that it was challenging for you, though. That's nice to know.
Yes.
Wonderful. And with that, I will close. Again, thank you very much for everybody who was listening. Thanks for everybody who brings in their thoughts on our website. And Bruno, we will give you some information about the following interviews with some of your colleagues in the economic trade or political trade, if you're interested in what other people say on the same questions. And with that, I would say, have a wonderful day wherever you are, and speak to you all again soon. Take good care.
Bye.